My husband stood up at his own 40th birthday dinner in front of 30 of his closest friends and colleagues, raised his glass toward my mother, and said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "Let's toast to Diane, who spent 40 years cleaning other people's houses, so her daughter could marry someone who actually made something of himself." The table went silent. My mother's face went white, and I sat there for exactly 4 seconds deciding whether to let this be the moment everything I'd spent 3 years quietly building came out into the open. I chose to let it come out. What my husband didn't know, what almost nobody at that table knew, was that the someone who actually made something of himself was at that exact moment personally, financially dependent on a woman he'd just humiliated in front of everyone he wanted to impress. This is that story. Subscribe because it only gets more satisfying from here. Let's get into it. My name is Rebecca. I'm 32. I want to start this story with my mother Diane because understanding exactly who she is and exactly what my husband didn't know about her is the entire foundation of everything that happened at that dinner. My mother spent close to 4 decades working as a house cleaner, building over the years a small, but genuinely thriving business of her own, starting as a solo cleaner in her 20s, and eventually through relentless disciplined saving and reinvestment, growing into a company that employed 9 people and served a loyal roster of clients across our region. She never talked about the business as anything glamorous. She showed up, she worked hard, and she quietly, methodically built financial security for our family in a way that never once depended on anyone else's approval. What almost nobody outside our immediate family knew, and what I'd never once mentioned to my husband in 3 years of marriage, was what my mother had actually done with the proceeds of that business over the decades. She hadn't simply banked her earnings conservatively. Starting when I was in my early 20s, my mother had begun investing methodically in local commercial real estate, small strip malls, a handful of office buildings, properties she'd acquired gradually, always with a level of financial discipline that would have surprised anyone who only knew her as the cleaning lady. A phrase I'd heard used dismissively more than once over the years by people who had no idea what actually sat behind it. By the time I met my husband Marcus, my mother's real estate portfolio was worth conservatively just over $11 million, a fact I knew intimately because I'd helped her informally with some of the underlying financial analysis over the years, part of a business degree I'd pursued specifically because watching my mother build something from nothing had shaped how I thought about money and value from a young age. I want to be honest about why I never told Marcus any of this in any real detail during our courtship or the early years of our marriage. Part of it was simple privacy. My mother, deeply private about her finances despite her success, had always encouraged me to keep specifics quiet, understanding from decades of experience exactly how differently people treated you once they knew real numbers were involved. But part of it, if I'm honest, was something I only fully understood in hindsight. Some instinct in me had from fairly early in the relationship sensed something in Marcus that made me cautious about revealing too much too quickly. I met Marcus when I was 28 at a professional networking event, and I want to describe honestly who he was and who he presented himself as, because the gap between those two things matters enormously to this story. Marcus worked in commercial finance, successful by most conventional measures, a good salary, an impressive title, a confidence that in the early months of our relationship I found genuinely magnetic. He came from a family that placed enormous emphasis on status, on visible markers of success, on the specific social currency of who you knew and where you'd been. I noticed fairly early on a particular pattern in how Marcus talked about people, a kind of automatic, almost reflexive categorization based on profession, income, visible signifiers of wealth or success. It showed up in small comments about coworkers, about acquaintances, about strangers we'd pass on the street. I told myself for longer than I probably should have that this was simply a somewhat superficial personality quirk, not a genuine red flag about his character. When Marcus met my mother for the first time about 7 months into our relationship, I watched this pattern play out directly for the first time. My mother, characteristically unpretentious, had mentioned in passing that she ran a cleaning business, true, though obviously an incomplete picture of her actual financial situation. I watched Marcus's demeanor toward her shift subtly, but unmistakably in the moments following that comment, slightly less engaged, slightly more perfunctory in his questions, a kind of quiet social recalibration I recognized uncomfortably as him mentally repositioning my mother somewhere lower on whatever internal hierarchy he used to organize the people in his life. I confronted him gently about this after that first meeting, and he denied any change in behavior, insisting he'd been perfectly warm and respectful. I let it go partly because I wasn't entirely certain of my own read on the situation, and partly because if I'm honest, I was deeply in love with him at that point and reluctant to build a serious conflict around something that felt at the time more like an impression than concrete evidence. Over the following 2 years of dating, and the first year of our marriage, this pattern continued in small, consistent ways. Occasional comments about my mother's profession delivered with a faint, barely perceptible condescension, a general reluctance to spend much time with her compared to how eagerly he engaged with his own more conventionally successful extended family. I found myself increasingly keeping my mother somewhat separate from my life with Marcus, not through any deliberate strategy, but simply as a way of avoiding the low-grade discomfort I felt whenever they interacted. I want to walk through exactly why I chose deliberately over 3 years of marriage to keep the full picture of my mother's financial success from Marcus, because I think this decision, more than any other single choice, shaped everything that eventually happened. About 8 months into our engagement, my mother sat me down for a serious conversation, one I've thought back on countless times since. She told me plainly that she'd observed the same pattern in Marcus that I'd been quietly noticing myself: a subtle, but real tendency to value people based on visible markers of status and success, rather than their actual character. She told me she wasn't asking me to end the relationship, that she trusted my judgment about who I chose to marry. But she asked me directly to consider keeping the full extent of her financial success private from Marcus, at least for the time being, as a kind of test, not a manipulative one. She was careful to specify, simply an honest opportunity to observe how he treated her, and by extension how he might eventually treat me, based purely on what he believed to be true, rather than what was actually the case. I agreed somewhat reluctantly, at first uncomfortable with the idea of withholding something significant from the man I was about to marry. But as the pattern continued to play out over the following months and years, the subtle condescension, the reluctance to invest time in a relationship with a woman he apparently believed to be simply a hard-working house cleaner, I found myself increasingly understanding exactly why my mother had suggested this. I want to be honest about something else that developed during this period, something that became directly relevant to the dinner, where everything eventually came out. About 1.5 years into our marriage, Marcus's own financial situation became considerably more precarious than either of us had anticipated. A significant investment he'd made largely without consulting me in any real detail went badly wrong, and within a matter of months we found ourselves facing a genuinely serious financial shortfall, one that without intervention threatened our ability to maintain the mortgage on the house we'd purchased together, a house Marcus had insisted on buying in an upscale neighborhood, specifically aligned with the image of success he cared about projecting. I brought this situation to my mother without initially telling Marcus the full extent of what I was doing, and she agreed, after careful consideration and appropriate legal documentation, to provide a substantial private loan, just over $300,000, structured formally with proper interest terms, specifically to help us stabilize our finances during that difficult period. I told Marcus at the time that the funds had come from some savings and a smaller loan from family, deliberately vague, not wanting to reveal the true scale of my mother's actual wealth, and honestly still somewhat protective of the private understanding I'd built with her. I want to walk through the period following that loan because it matters enormously to understanding the specific layered irony of what eventually unfolded at Marcus's birthday dinner. For the following 1.5 years, our household finances were functionally substantially dependent on my mother's generosity, not just the initial $300,000 loan, but ongoing modest additional support that helped us maintain the lifestyle Marcus was determined to preserve, even as his own career hit further difficulties following the initial investment loss. I managed most of this financial coordination directly with my mother, largely without Marcus fully understanding the specifics, an arrangement that, I'll be honest, sat increasingly uncomfortably with me as time went on. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't hiding this out of some elaborate long-term scheme to eventually expose Marcus dramatically. I genuinely believed for much of this period that I was simply managing a private, sensitive family matter with appropriate discretion, the same way my mother had always approached her own finances. It was only in the weeks leading up to that birthday dinner that everything crystallized into the specific moment it eventually became. During this same period, I watched Marcus's attitude toward my mother continue largely unchanged, despite the fact that her quiet private support was in very real terms keeping our household financially stable. He continued referring to her in conversations with his own friends and family in ways that consistently minimized her. Rebecca's mom does some cleaning work, delivered with a specific dismissive lightness that I found increasingly difficult to sit through silently. About 4 months before the dinner, my mother and I had another significant conversation. She told me gently but directly that she was growing concerned about the sustainability of continuing to prop up our household finances indefinitely, while Marcus remained apparently unaware of and seemingly uninterested in acknowledging the actual source of the stability he was benefiting from. She suggested carefully that at some point the truth would need to come out, not necessarily dramatically, but honestly, as part of a healthier foundation for our marriage going forward. I agreed with her in principle, but struggled over the following months to find the right moment or approach to have that conversation with Marcus directly. Part of me, I think, was still processing my own complicated feelings about a marriage that had by that point revealed itself to be built on a foundation considerably less solid in terms of Marcus's character than I'd believed when we first got engaged. Marcus's 40th birthday, coming up about 7 weeks after that conversation with my mother, became, without either of us fully planning it, that way the moment everything eventually converged. Marcus wanted a significant celebration, a private room at an upscale restaurant, 30 guests largely composed of his professional colleagues and closest friends, people whose opinions of him mattered enormously in the specific social and professional circles he cared most about impressing. He asked me several weeks in advance whether my mother would be attending, in a tone that carried unmistakably a hope that she might not, or might attend only briefly, given how carefully curated the guest list and overall image of the evening clearly was in his mind. I told him directly that my mother would absolutely be attending, that she was my mother, and this was a significant family occasion regardless of how he felt about the optics of her presence. He didn't push back further, though I could tell the response wasn't the one he'd hoped for. I want to be honest about my own state of mind in the days leading up to that dinner. I'd made a private decision somewhere in that final week that I was no longer willing to continue managing the specific exhausting dynamic of watching Marcus minimize my mother while quietly benefiting from her financial support. I didn't have a fully formed plan for exactly how or when the full truth might come out. I simply knew with a clarity that felt important that I was done actively protecting Marcus from a reality he'd been avoiding, whether consciously or not, for the entire length of our marriage. The dinner itself started pleasantly enough, good food, genuine warmth from most of the guests, Marcus visibly enjoying being the center of attention among the exact audience he most cared about impressing. My mother sat near the middle of the long table, quiet, gracious, as always, engaging warmly with the guests seated near her. About 90 minutes in, as the celebratory toasts began, Marcus stood, glass in hand, and began a speech that started reasonably enough, thanking his colleagues, his friends, reflecting on turning 40 with the kind of practiced, self-assured humor that had always come naturally to him in these settings. Then, apparently attempting a moment of humor that I believe he genuinely thought would land warmly rather than cruelly, he turned toward my mother, raised his glass in her direction, and delivered the toast that opened this story, the comment about her spending 40 years cleaning other people's houses so her daughter could marry someone who'd actually made something of himself. I want to describe the room in that moment as precisely as I can. There was a beat of stunned silence before a handful of uncomfortable, uncertain laughs rippled through parts of the table, the kind of laughter people offer when they're not entirely sure whether something was meant as a joke or not, hedging their reaction accordingly. My mother's face for just a moment showed real hurt before she composed herself into the calm, dignified expression I'd watched her deploy countless times over the years in the face of people underestimating her. I sat there for exactly 4 seconds, I remember, counting in the strange, hyper-aware clarity of that moment, deciding what I wanted to do next. And then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think the calm, measured quality of what I said next mattered enormously to how it landed in that room. I said, looking directly at Marcus, "Since we're doing toasts, I think it's worth everyone here knowing something about the woman you just made a joke about." I turned to the table and told them plainly the truth I'd kept private for 3 years. That my mother's cleaning business had been the foundation of an $11 million real estate portfolio she'd built methodically over 4 decades. That the $300,000 that had kept our household financially stable during Marcus's investment losses 18 months earlier had come directly from her. That the man standing at the head of the table toasting his own success had been, for the better part of 2 years, quietly substantially dependent on the woman he'd just humiliated in front of everyone he most wanted to impress. I want to describe what happened in the immediate aftermath of that moment, because the shift in the room was almost physically palpable. Marcus's face went through several rapid stages: initial confusion, as though he genuinely couldn't process what I'd just said, followed by a kind of dawning horrified realization as he understood I wasn't exaggerating or making a point rhetorically, but stating simple verifiable fact in front of 30 people whose opinions he cared about enormously. Several of his colleagues I noticed exchanged glances that told their own story, a recalibration happening in real time, watching a man who'd built much of his social standing on projecting effortless success revealed in a single moment as someone who'd been privately dependent on the very woman he'd just publicly disparaged. My mother, for her part, remained remarkably composed throughout, though I caught her hand finding mine under the table, a small grounding gesture I appreciated more than I could have expressed in that moment. She didn't add anything further to what I'd said she didn't need to. The facts laid out plainly did all the necessary work on their own. Marcus attempted briefly to recover, offering something that started as an apology, but quickly veered into defensive justification, suggesting I'd embarrassed him unnecessarily, that this wasn't the time or place for that kind of disclosure and argument, that given what he'd just done to my mother moments earlier landed with almost nobody at that table. The dinner effectively ended shortly after that, guests making increasingly hasty, awkward exits. Over the following 20 minutes, the celebratory atmosphere Marcus had so carefully curated completely irreversibly dissolved. Marcus and I drove home largely in silence, the specific charged silence of two people who both understood something significant had just shifted permanently between them, neither quite ready to be the first to speak. Once home, the conversation that followed was long, difficult, and I think ultimately necessary in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Marcus alternated between genuine visible shame at what he'd said to my mother and a kind of defensive anger at how I'd chosen to respond, insisting that regardless of what he'd said, exposing our private financial situation in front of his colleagues had been unnecessarily humiliating, for him specifically. I told him calmly but firmly something I'd been building toward for the entire length of our marriage without fully realizing it. That I understood he felt humiliated, and that I wasn't entirely without sympathy for how disorienting that moment must have been for him. But I told him that what he'd said to my mother in front of 30 people had been a deliberate, calculated attempt to elevate his own status by demeaning her, and that the specific irony of that moment, a man dependent on the very person he was mocking, wasn't something I'd engineered maliciously. It was simply finally the truth catching up with a pattern he'd been allowed to maintain unchallenged for 3 entire years of our marriage. I told him further that I'd spent those 3 years watching him consistently minimize and dismiss my mother based purely on his assumptions about her financial and social status, and that I'd made a private decision in the weeks leading up to his birthday that I was no longer willing to actively participate in protecting him from a reality that directly contradicted those assumptions. Marcus, to his eventual credit, didn't immediately storm off or escalate the conversation further. He sat with what I'd said, visibly working through genuine discomfort, and eventually acknowledged haltingly that he understood, at least intellectually, why I'd reached the point I had, even as he continued struggling with the specific public nature of how the truth had come out. It's been just over a year since that dinner, and I want to be honest that our marriage has undergone significant difficult change since then, not an immediate ending, though I know some people expect that framing given everything that happened. Marcus and I are still together, working through a version of our relationship that looks considerably different than it did before. He's engaged over the past year in real sustained work, individual therapy, specifically addressing the status-driven patterns that shaped so much of how he'd approached relationships throughout his adult life, including his relationship with my mother. Their relationship remains a work in progress, though genuinely improved. He's made deliberate, consistent efforts to engage with her authentically, without the subtle condescension that characterized their earlier interactions, and I believe, watching them together now, that at least some of that change is genuine rather than merely performative. My mother, for her part, has been remarkably gracious throughout this entire process, never using the incident as ongoing leverage or humiliation, extending Marcus genuine opportunities to demonstrate real change rather than holding the initial comment over him indefinitely. I've also, in the year since, restructured how our household finances actually work, with full transparency now between all 3 of us regarding my mother's ongoing support, and the terms of the original loan formalized properly rather than existing as a private, somewhat murky arrangement between my mother and me alone. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. The people who consistently minimize others based on visible markers of success or status are often making assumptions built on considerably less solid ground than they realize, and sometimes the truth simply needs an honest moment to catch up with the pattern they've been allowed to maintain unchallenged. I don't take particular pride in how that specific moment unfolded at Marcus's birthday dinner. I would have genuinely preferred a version of our marriage where that kind of disclosure was never necessary, where Marcus's respect for my mother had never depended on information he didn't yet have. But I also don't regret finally clearly refusing to continue protecting a pattern of behavior that had gone unaddressed for 3 years, simply because the truth was inconvenient to reveal. If you've ever watched someone you love be consistently underestimated or minimized by someone who claims to care about you, I hope this story reminds you that you're allowed to stop quietly managing that dynamic, and that sometimes the most honest thing you can do is simply let the truth speak for itself in its own time at its own volume. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories about family marriage and the moments when the truth finally catches up. I've got plenty more where this one came from.